Milk may start on the farm, but it has a global story far beyond our refrigerator or table. Welcome back to Rooted and Restless. I'm Marianne Smith-Edge. And to continue our discovery about digging deeper into the stories behind food, who better than my guest today to talk about just how complicated it is, the story around milk. My guest is Tom Suber, a global trade strategist, former and first president of the U.S. Dairy Export Council, and currently serves on the board of directors for a large cheese maker. And surprisingly, and maybe only appropriate, even though I worked in D.C. and Tom lives there, our paths didn't cross until we were far beyond the border of the U.S., actually in the deserts of Mongolia, a story that we'll tell before we finish. So, Tom, thank you very much for being here. I think a good way, many times, I grew up on a dairy farm, but back then I wasn't thinking about that we actually had a global track around milk. So you grew up in Chicago. How did a Chicago boy get into the whole global milk export business?
Circuitously, in a short word, and then digress on it. Thank you for having me on, Marianne. I greatly appreciate your invitation. I did grow up in the suburbs north of Chicago, and unlike most people who ended up in the dairy industry, I didn't have an uncle, I didn't have a father, I didn't have a legacy on the farm. You certainly can't count the fact that I was carried a political banner in the Harvard, Illinois Milk Day Parade in 1964. That doesn't quite count, I don't think. But Lake County is one of the biggest dairy counties in the state of Illinois, but still that doesn't really matter because I ended up at Colorado State University as a history major. I then went to Georgetown for my foreign service degree and ended up in international trade, ultimately, for industrial and water treatment equipment. So I learned international trade. And only through a series of career readjustments did I find myself working with the dairy industry, who in 1990 had realized that with the Canada Free Trade Agreement, the upcoming Mexico-U.S. agreement, which would become NAFTA when rolled in with Canada, and the Uruguay round of trade, that dairy was going to lose its very long protected status. Dairy, there are four white ag commodities that were considered problematic by USDA from international trade point of view. There was sugar, there was rice, there was cotton, and there were dairy. And they all had their own reasons why they had trouble competing internationally. But dairy had very high import barriers. We were protected. We had this funky, weird pricing system. We exported in 1990 only about 3% of our milk production. And half of that was donated overseas. We simply had no interest. We, in fact, had great fear over the international market. But they saw that the tide was turning, and first the H.W. Bush administration and then Clinton said, this is coming, so you've got to get ready for this. And that's when USDEC was formed by farmers to help processors and cooperatives and trading companies find their way into the international market. We didn't sell it, but we helped pave the ground for that.
So I'm interested when we think about shipping milk, and maybe we need to even step back and even define milk, so to speak, because in today's world, milk can extend from what would be a plant-based beverage that is called milk to actual milk, which is from a mammal, and we'll talk a little bit more. So here, of course, we're talking dairy cow milk in this aspect, but talk a little bit about, thinking, I grew up with the milk in a tanker going to the processor, and of course, then eventually getting to the milk carton on the shelf. But obviously, if we're shipping milk across the water, I'm guessing we're not shipping it in tankers, so to speak. So I think it's interesting to think about what is being shipped, and also the countries where we see the greatest opportunities, and why the exports?
Sure. Well, the issue it comes to what is dairy, and it really matters who's benefiting. And in this case, we're talking about the dairy farmer, your legacy, not my own personal one. And the issue is anything that comes from the dairy milk is something that would read down to the benefit of dairy farmers if you can expand the markets. That's what the dairy checkoff promotion was all about. Find new markets. Most of it was focused domestically, but there was a sense of, okay, every other ag commodity in the world has figured out how to compete internationally, or at least are seeking to. So where were the major buyers of dairy products? And you're talking about a spectrum here, going from fluid milk, because there was sterile brick packed milk in the Tetra Pak cartons that you would see overseas. There was cheese, of course. There was milk powder that was either without fat, which is skim milk powder, or with fat, whole milk powder. And there's butter. And then there are the derivatives of all of that. You get into whey proteins, you get into different kinds of milk powders, and of course, many, many different kinds of cheeses, along with the milk sugar lactose. So anything that comes from that dairy milk is something that a greater market penetration, greater market expansion is going to ultimately help the funders of the program, which are dairy farmers.
Which makes sense, and I think this gives you give a good perspective of looking at, quote, the term milk in a much broader sense. We're just not talking about fluid milk, but of course, as you mentioned, cheese, because after all, we import cheese as well. So who's some of our biggest, I guess, not competitors, but who are some our biggest customers in regards to U.S. dairy products? If
you don't mind, let me go back to competitors, because it does provide some setup a little bit. Because again, we'll talk only briefly about the beginning, then we can talk about the present. But back when this all started, you really only had the European Union, which is a massive milk producer for obvious reasons. Holsteins, in fact, obviously come from the Netherlands. But when they set up their quotas, when they set up their Common Agricultural Program in the 80s, they set their quotas at 17 to 20% over their domestic needs. So they built in a structural surplus, and they had that extra surplus that they then subsidized into world markets. And this was about their social welfare program, if you will, for farmers. It wasn't just in dairy, but they propped them up and then helped them export, because the exporters of the world beyond the European Union were primarily New Zealand and Australia, with a little bit out of Argentina. The U.S. was, as I mentioned before, virtually non-existent. So you had this very low milk price because of the international milk equivalent dairy price was very low because European subsidies drove it down so low. So the fear of what we could sell was quite profound. How can we compete at that level? And that's why a lot of our early exports have been donated. Well, you have to start with what you can start with. And there are two areas there. And one was going to higher value products like cheese and ice cream. And that meant primarily countries where they had a taste for it or we could get access to that. And that was primarily Mexico and Japan. Japan was then a large cheese importer, has since become even larger. Mexico, of course, is contiguous, long border, and the Mexico Free Trade Agreement through NAFTA was coming into effect. Those two became obvious non-commodity destinations. Non-commodity, not taking the massive amounts of milk powder and butter and block cheese that normally would drive dairy trade. I'm not mentioning Canada, because Canada has even a more rigid dairy system than we have, and very tight import barriers, which have led to quarrels and WTO arbitration cases over the years, which I must say Canada has routinely lost, not all, but have routinely lost, and have been problematic in their implementation. That's a later topic, if at all necessary. So the early places were for higher value products, but over time, as the export subsidies were diminished out of Europe, global demand came greater into in the front with China entering its growth spurt of per capita income and per capita demands for dairy protein. Then it began to be milk powders. Then it began to be whey proteins. Then it began to also be block cheese, commodity cheese for processing or for cut and wrap.
Well, I think then I used the right word, competitor, as well as customer, because you really, I think it gives us all, it's like any other business. It is, you produce it, you have to have customers, and guess what? There are competitors. So it's very interesting how you frame it. When we talk about products, and as you know, whey protein, of course, years ago was not even viewed as a product, and now, of course, it's such a valuable product. Based on what you've seen and your current work, you know, when we look at what are the products that we export, you know, what's at the top of the list? I mean, you mentioned several of them, but do we export more whey protein or cheese, or obviously it probably depends on where it's going?
It certainly doesn't. There are sharply different values for each of these, if you will. Just to give an example now, milk powder is about $1.40 a pound. Cheese happens to be $1.80 a pound. Butter, of course, could be anywhere from $2.50 to now down around $1.80, $1.70. And whey proteins, depending on what concentration, cheap whey, and we'll talk about that a little bit, goes for like 70 cents per pound, unless you isolate that protein down to 90% level, and that goes for $12 to $13 a pound. So you can get down to some very high value proteins as you move down that. But overall, in terms of volume, let's talk about milk solids. Cheese and whey and milk powders are our largest milk, whether it's protein or fat together is milk components. Those are the three largest ones we send out.
So we talk about export. Do we actually import any dairy? I mean, obviously we import cheese from different countries, but I'll say outside of the cheese, or butter. Everybody talks about butter from Ireland. Is there particularly any other large volumes that come in?
Yeah, we've had long-standing import quotas, and truth be told, we have been less flexible in our import arrangements than we have sought from others, if I can make that clear. So we do have substantial amounts of butterfat imports that come in as mixtures, that come in as butter oil, or they come in as butter, the retail type. And we also have some milk powders and milk and chocolate mixes that have milk powder in them. Those used to be tariff busters because we had these barriers, so people would make these funky little mixes of cocoa powder and milk powder to come in under an unprotected line. So we are an importer. We had a very sharp trade deficit in milk for many, many years, up until the early 2000s, when we began to go into a surplus situation and are now massively exporting more than we import.
Which is good for the dairy farmer. And I think that's the key here, is that we always talk about the importance of local, and it is important of local and regional systems. But at the same time, I think we have to realize is for the dairy farmer, it's not just, you know, a small group. We have to look at it at a broader audience, so to speak, or customers globally, because after all, we have to think about how to keep it in business economically.
Right. And of course, you can't just make what we sell here necessarily. Foreign tastes, foreign citizens, foreign tastes, different formats, different fat concentrations, different flavor profiles. All the things require some study, some innovation, some accommodation, some flexibility. And Americans generally have been slow to that, but we've become better over the years on accommodating. But when you're starting off with just three basic commodities, you have to think about what you're doing before you can become successful.
Now, let's hear from Mindy Herman, registered dietitian, food and nutrition writer, and a guru on all the latest food trends.
Hi, Marianne. Happy National Flower Month. I hope you celebrated National Flower Day on March 20th with a nice crusty bread. And did you know that flour is over 2,000 years old? And that there are bakeries in every state across the United States, as well as the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. According to the American Bakers Association, the baking industry employs almost 800,000 skilled workers. It generates over $42 billion in direct wages, and it has an overall economic impact of over $186 billion. And according to the Food Marketing Institute, almost all U.S. households buy something from the grocery store bakery at least once a month, with nearly two-thirds of households buying something weekly. What are the fan favorites? It's no surprise. Cakes, cookies, muffins, and other sweet treats are top sellers, although it'll be interesting to see if weight loss drugs take a bite out of grocery store bakery sales. Hey, Marianne, I gotta go now. It's time to punch down my bread dough.
Now, let's return to our conversation. Well, let's think about milk beyond the dairy cow. I know they're in other parts of the world. Milk is consumed not just from the dairy cow, the mammal. There's definitely camel milk. You and I, and you probably in some of your travels prior to Mongolia, had consumed mare's milk. But I think the interesting thing, I remember being at a food conference probably 10 years ago in London, and there was a vendor that was really promoting the value of camel's milk and that this was going to be the next greatest thing. I will say I tasted it. It was a little more acidic than I would have. It wouldn't be on my table on a daily basis. But I'm curious, in all your travels globally, outside of our trip together in Mongolia, what are some of the other milks from mammals that definitely have a place on the table?
Well, you'll know a few right off the bat, but I'm gonna talk about six. And you mentioned two of the more exotic ones, which would be mare's milk and camel milk. But of course, there's sheep milk, and of course, there's goat milk, and of course, there's cow milk. And the sixth one was also present in Mongolia, which we didn't actually have, which would be yak milk. And so, but then of course there are other milks that are fed throughout the world because mammals rely upon their own female milk to feed their young. So it's universal. But the ones that I would gravitate towards would be cow's milk. I'm quite conventional in that regard. I'm surprised you drank the camel milk. We did try that in Mongolia, as you recall, and the mare's milk too. And both of them were interesting. Let's go with a nebulous word like that. And they certainly would have been better if they'd been chilled. Having them warm was an obstacle to overcome. The mare's milk is been famous in history, called kumis, because it was usually fermented and therefore alcoholic, and was how many of the nomads in the steppes along the Eurasian steppe lands would carry their milk in leather satchels, which would ferment and on the trail, if you will. It became the sustenance and food for many of the Mongolian raiders that swept through that area, but there were raiders for centuries before and after that who also relied upon mare's milk. Really a fundamental beverage and food that drove great changes to history. Well, kumis, I think it was called.
Well, and we actually got to taste some of that. So maybe I should back up to the audience and say, that Tom and I weren't the only two out in the Gobi Desert in Mongolia almost 3 years ago. By mutual friends, we became part of the delegation with a sister city from Denver, who has a sister city relationship with Ulaanbaatar. And so our good friend Tom Wagenlander and my connection through Tom was with Mary Lee Chin, who's a registered dietitian. And so just a little backstory is that Tom and I were in a SUV with another gentleman who probably heard more about dairy than he ever wanted to hear, because when you drive in the Gobi Desert, you just drive in the Gobi Desert. And you drive for 3 or 4 hours, and then you may stop, and then you get back in the vehicle and you drive again. So there's lots of times so Tom and I actually made that connection that we, it was like, who do you know in the dairy industry, and definitely talked. But it was great. It was great fun to make those connections, but also to experience some of the customs and traditions of the Mongolia people. And so when you mentioned mare's milk, we both were invited to participate in a game. I believe it was a game, a song, something that, and if you lost, you were supposed to drink the fermented mare's milk. The good news is we had some of our Mongolia counterparts that were more than willing to take our share if we didn't want to.
Well, I do remember our driver, one particular driver, burly guy, good head of hair, drinking the milk through the saucer, and came out with a song about his mother and feeding the milk to the children and harvesting the milk. It was a very touching praise for his mother and his role in the family, but also reflecting how important it was in their culture that someone was harvesting and feeding the milk. It was quite a scene.
So yes, I think that in that that's a good example that milk, whether from goat, sheep, are different. It definitely not only provides the nutrition but it also is such a tradition and has such a cultural influence in so many aspects in that aspect. So a couple of quick things thinking about, I'd be interested, in your travels, I'm about how milk is some of the maybe the differences in some of the different countries. One question I had for you, and it's always interesting, is why do we see so much sterile packaged on the shelf milk in the EU, but you may have it here, but it's not usually going to be purchased or very small. So I'm curious how that seems to have been much more accepted in the EU than we see it in the U.S.
We've all seen that over the years, and it has been a wonderment. Most of it derives from how the cold chain, the refrigerated chain of food is handled, or was handled anyway, back in Europe, and the size of their households. To move fresh milk, pasteurized milk, as we would conventionally pasteurized milk, as we would drink it, requires a cold chain that can take it from the farm to the processor, and then take it to the grocery store, take it to the house, and have it be properly cared for with enough space in the house. With refrigeration being an early factor in most American households, there was usually plenty of refrigeration space, and it was an appliance that most families had a good size of one. Europe, it was not that case. Household size and extent of refrigeration, certainly in the home, was more limited. So in the method first created by the Tetra Pak company of sterilizing milk at a higher temperature for pasteurization than we might normally do here, would allow it to be put into these sterile brick packs that would basically stay without refrigeration with a very, very long shelf life. The shelf life would incidentally begin to click as you first opened it. It wasn't, you couldn't open it and leave it forever, but unopened it lasted a very long time. And though it had a little bit of a caramelized taste to it that Americans would characterize as burnt, it was certainly quite conventional and normal over there. Here, because of the way we set up, with the fact that there were dairy farms in all 50 states, an issue that Congress never forgets, that there are cows in every state that have to be tended to. The ability to deliver refrigerated milk was profound and extensive, and that eventually drove that became the way it was done here. And we have in the last few years had to adapt that sterile packaging technique in order to ship milk in the limited amounts that we do overseas.
Well, and I think that's interesting. It's kind of the supply and demand concept is what you get used to is what's available, and then so the acceptance is will vary, of course. I think it. So I'm curious as we're wrapping up. We've seen milk in the headlines lately, of course, a lot of times, but why the adoption now of whole milk in schools? Why is that considered a big win for U.S. dairy?
I've been wondering about the magnitude of the cheering on this. It's certainly a safe food. It's a nutritious food. And to the dairyman or dairywoman, the dairy family, it is the milk almost as it comes out of the cow. You moderated the fat a little, that it might, instead of coming out of the tank at 4% or 4.3% milk fat, it's leveled down to 3.25 is what whole milk is. And they consider that is the food they make. This is the one they believe in so much. And therefore, there was a certain emotional feel that this should be represented as broadly as possible, and the limitation of selling in schools was jarring to them. There was also the sense that this is the best tasting milk, not just the most nutritious, and therefore children will be turned off to lesser milks, whether it's 2%, 1%, or 0% milk, and therefore they'd lose the category. They'd be out of the category entirely and never come back, which is a problem with the way consumption goes through a child's life. And milk consumption did start going down radically in the early 90s. It's considered up until quite recently did it begin to flatten. And one of the biggest changes, of course, has been consumer eating patterns. The biggest one being the loss of breakfast cereal as a massive problem in undermining milk growth. And there is some sense that whole milk might bring people back to the milk category. That does mean they may move from 2% to whole or skim to whole, depending on taste. But I'm not certain it will create a renaissance in milk consumption. I think it might flatten it. It certainly will reflect the product that the dairy farmers believe in so much. But I'm not certain that it changes a lot there. You as a nutritionist can speak better to the arguments pro and con as to having done so. But I think it was much of a symbolic victory for the wholeness and wholesomeness of milk as it was for long-term consumption.
And, at the bottom line, if it does increase consumption, then a little bit more fat is probably not going to be an issue. You will appreciate that. You can imagine what my father thought when at 16 I declared that I was not drinking the milk that he was producing because it had too much fat, and therefore I was going to go buy skim milk. I guess I must have known that I was going to be a dietitian then, but my story was, hey, I'm buying it from the same company that we're shipping it to, so all is equal. but that raised a few hairs on his neck.
I'm surprised you didn't end up having to work your way through school. Maybe you didn't have to work your way through school.
I did. Being the only daughter probably helped alleviate some of that, though, in that regard. Well, I'm curious. what we're all talking about, what makes milk consumption. And I will say it doesn't matter what conversation that I'm in with what industry, is that the big question is how does the impact of these new meds, weight loss meds, i.e. we'll call them GLP-1s in general, how do you see that affecting, positive or negative, the consumption of dairy in the future? Because obviously some food groups have definitely been affected.
Well, it's an excellent question, and I can tell you it's a question that's being talked about in every boardroom of every company that's in the food business, and certainly the ones who feed that, the agricultural chain. GLP-1s, as they're called, the Wegovy's or the brand names, some that are out there, they're sharply changing the manner by which those people consume their food. One is generally a lesser volume of calories. Two, they're generally cutting out a lot of carbohydrates as they do so, increasing protein consumption substantially. Fat seems to be more of a neutral item in this discussion. It tends to go back and forth based upon calories. But the issue is the volume of food and the types of food that these patients would be consuming. And while cheese is quite friendly to the normal nutritional profile that a GLP-1 patient would use, the stuff that cheese is on, the carrier for cheese, may not be. And here you have pizza, which has been the elevator for cheese consumption since the late 80s, right through until just recently. There is some concerns about pizza flattening. And of course, pasta is not a huge one for that. So cheese is a very good GLP-1 as a snack or as a big snack to eat on its own, but it's not so. It could be damaged by the overall change in the manner by which people eat food. And then you have the alter ego of cheese, which is its whey protein. As you make cheese, the solid protein that's in cheese is casein protein. The other protein is a whey protein, and that when the cheese coagulates when the milk coagulates to come into cheese, the whey protein is separated. It's usually a liquid form of about 13%. Then you can dry it and concentrate it to be 34, 80, and 90%. And that product has become extremely popular to be put into anything these days. It used to start with power bars, it used to start with power drinks. Now it's in cereal. It's in all sorts of other processed foods because the protein level, people want more protein, even though the levels are probably pretty well satisfactory for most people under consumption. And they also want it, as a GLP user, to deal with the muscle wasting issues that come from that GLP-1 medication. GLP-1, the medication, the muscle wasting issue is also a sarcopenia issue for elderly folks, and as our population ages, that's also becoming important. So the dairy protein is a very friendly carrier for people wishing to satisfy their food needs there. But that does mean other dairy foods may be left behind, or the overall volume of that might decline. Butter doesn't really count in this category. It's sort of neutral in the middle. It doesn't have any protein in it. Fat, it's just a matter of what you're going to be eating elsewhere in your diet.
Well, and you explained it so well, and you're right. And I mean, the good news about dairy whey protein, of course, is a high quality protein. So when you're really looking at it, that's the important thing. But you also, why from the farmer to the boardroom, why such a common food such as milk suddenly has a very complicated story behind it, because it so many things drive consumption or acceptance from, as you say, from butter to just a glass of milk, and while one wins, suddenly the company that's making all the cheese for pizzas suddenly does not. So that makes definitely makes a difference. Well, Tom, thank you so much. It was great to reconnect. It was great fun that our paths crossed almost 3 years ago in the desert, and I hope we don't have to go back to Mongolia for our paths to cross again in this regard. But you bring so much insight to the story behind what we know as just milk is really much more complicated than it seems. So thank you again, and see you soon.
I appreciate that very much. Let me just leave your listeners with one thought about yourself, because they may not know just what great intestinal fortitude you have. In this trip to the Gobi Desert, you and one other woman amongst our group of folks, and there weren't too many youngins, and they were all seniors, but you and Beth were the only ones to make it up this sand dune that was massively high, massively hot, and we were all very impressed by your grit and persistence.
Well, thank you. And I must say, Beth, as competitive as myself, we did take a little pride that we left the men, halfway down the dune.
We weren't even close.
Well, perhaps that's a good way to celebrate. After all, March is Women's History Month, so that'll be our shining moment, right?
Take and run with it.
Thank you so much, Tom. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you again.
Talking with Tom today, I think we can all agree that how food gets on our plate is a little more difficult than we think. Whether it's produced locally or we get cheese from France, it all though starts on a farm. Starts on a farm and gets to our table. Maybe a few miles or maybe miles across the water. But it still depends on farmers taking care of their animals, their land, and connecting it to the power of nutrition and the goodness of food. So here's to our health, and here's to those who produce our food. Thank you for listening, Rooted and Restless. It's all about digging deeper into the behind the scenes about food, agriculture, and nutrition, because after all, every food has a story, and sometimes it's not as simple as it seems. Subscribe to Rooted and Restless wherever you listen to podcasts, or find us on YouTube.